Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton. But where to get great prices on gifts, they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
The earliest spy systems were set up by people who had absolute power. In other words, kings of kings, and emperors. And in fact, to be fair, the Roman system did not catch up with them until Augustus, because Augustus was the first person in an equivalent position.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. In this episode, we've got top novelist Peter Tonkin talking to us about spycraft in the ancient world. We've got loads more goodies coming up though, so make sure you follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up in the next episode, we've got a real treat, the absolute godfather of British spy writing, Nigel West. So tell your friends, drop us a follow and join us on Spy Masters. But right now, I'll hand you over to me talking to Peter Tonkin about Caesar's spies. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you on Spy Masters. So we're here today to talk about spies in the ancient world. Obviously, it's the basis of a few of your many novels involve spying in the Roman world just at the end of the Republic. I'd quite like to start, though, by thinking about the definition of spy, given that what we're talking about in the ancient world isn't quite the same as what we're talking about in the modern world. So how would you define the spies that you're writing about?
Well, in the ancient world, spying on a practical level started with lookouts, and then obviously lookouts needed to send messages. So communication became important, and messages eventually became encoded. Then as individual city-states began to expand and come against each other, a lot of information was collected by way of traders and merchants going from one place to another. And that's a system that's lasted right up to the modern day. You only have to think of the case of Greville Wynne, which was turned into a film with Benedict Cumberbatch called The Courier, which was the true story of a businessman who had contacts in Moscow, who was asked by MI6 to carry information and bring information back from Moscow, but he was caught and locked up. Then there's obviously the diplomatic service, which in modern times is seen as a very useful method of spying on many levels. Obviously, diplomats, as the British government has just announced is the case with Chinese, for instance, come across, they help local businesses, they help local councillors on the assumption that the councillors will owe them something when they move from local government to central government. But just on an aside, we might come back to it later, the Romans were really bad at diplomacy. Then that's all looking outwards. Looking inwards, of course, you've got the internal intelligence networks, the ancient equivalents of our MI5. There were specially trained warriors. The Romans were heavily influenced by classical and pre-classical Greeks, and they were most impressed, as we are, I suppose, by the Spartans and the way in which youthful warriors were trained in Sparta to be completely self-sufficient, a bit like our SAS, SBS and commandos. They, in fact, you couldn't be a Spartan warrior until you had lived alone and survived for several weeks with no help at all, and then killed a slave, just a random slave you happened to come across, before you reported back in. And the Romans, although by that time Sparta was a kind of Disneyland for them, they all went to see it. They were very impressed with that kind of military training. And then they started training their own troops in that kind of those kind of skills. Though, of course, the main machine of conquest that they used were the legions.
Taking a step back, so obviously the Romans are not the first classical empire. What are the earliest spy systems that we know about pre-Roman?
Well, the earliest spy systems were set up by people who had absolute power. In other words, kings of kings, and emperors. And in fact, to be fair, the Roman system did not catch up with them until Augustus, because Augustus was the first person in an equivalent position. But we're looking at the Hittites, the Persians, the Parthians, the Egyptians, of course, Macedonians, Babylonians, the Carthaginians, to a certain, well, Carthaginians were slightly different because they've got a ruling system which is a bit like the Roman system. But I think probably some of your listeners may want to correct me on this. Whereas Rome was surrounded by sort of verdant greenery and farms, etc., and there was no great pressure on them to go exploring in the early days, the Carthaginians, of course, being on the north coast of Africa, even though it was greener in those days, they tended to look out rather than in. And so the whole concept of the Carthaginians was that they had fleets that needed to signal. They went to other places to set up trading posts and needed to find out about the people who lived there in case they had to conquer them rather than negotiate with them. And so they had a completely different approach to intelligence than the Romans did, which is important because in the Punic Wars, Scipio Africanus, the great Roman general, learned a lot from the Carthaginian general Hannibal, the younger Hannibal. He learned about secret messages. They wrote, as many people did for centuries following, on wax tablets, for instance. And what they did with the wax was they poured it over a wooden board and then they wrote on it with a pointed stick. But what Hannibal did was he wrote his messages on the wood and then poured wax over the top so that people receiving his messages simply either scraped or melted the wax off and they got the message. Later on, of course, Caesar famously came up with a transposition code that he liked. It's still called Caesar's code. Basically, A became Z, B became A, C became etc., etc., etc. It was Greek, so alpha became omega, etc., etc. And that transposition code is still being used by the Tudors in the days of Robert Poley, Christopher Marlowe, Francis Walsingham, etc., though they have very much more cunning codes as well.
When we get to the early Romans, obviously, as you say, some of them are learning off their predecessors, but there seems to be a dividing line on intelligence pre-Augustus and post-Augustus. I mean, lots of things in the Roman world fall into that category. So can we just talk about Republic? Because obviously it isn't like these societies we've talked about. It's not a centralised single autocracy sending itself out. It's more complicated than that. And can you talk about a little bit about how intelligence sort of sits in that picture of warring individual kind of generals?
Yes, it is very much inward looking. The people like Scipio, who learned from their opponents, found it difficult to pass that information on, because very often they were either retired forcibly, or they were replaced militantly and effectively, or there was civil war. And so there was very little communication. The Senate made this situation worse in practical terms, because one hesitates to compare them to our House of Commons and House of Lords at the moment, but very often information would arrive and it would take the Senate ages to discuss it, come to some sort of agreement on it, and decide what ought to be done about it. And usually when they did that, then they chose someone they thought would be a suitable leader, and they sent him to lead. And the effectiveness of that depended entirely on their understanding of the situation. And although things got very much better after Augustus, even Augustus made one or two, shall we say, false steps to begin with, the most famous of which was sending Varus to northern Germany, as Augustus saw it, to a peaceable place that they were just Romanizing. All the northern Germans had settled down, they'd been conquered, they spoke Latin, their leaders had been in the legions, everything seemed absolutely fine to Augustus. So he sent Varus, who was a pretty brutal general, and Varus was supposed to just Romanize the place, build villas and olive groves going, and vineries and things, and settle everyone down. And it was a complete miscalculation on Augustus's part and whoever was advising him. One assumes probably Agrippa, though Agrippa got very few things wrong, bless him. But yes, further complication, of course, was that all of the members of the Senate were looking to stab each other in the back.
Just to pick up a little bit though on that, I mean, so even if there was good intelligence reaching Augustus that Germany wasn't quite as ready to be Romanized as he hoped it would be. I mean, obviously there's always a difference, isn't there, between the intelligence as it's sent to the person receiving the intelligence and how that intelligence is received and how it plays into somebody's existing kind of expectations and hopes and wants. And I wonder if that's just a classic case of, even if the intelligence was good, it wouldn't have mattered, because Augustus had that kind of Roman arrogance and a kind of sense of Roman purpose that wouldn't have been derailed by information to the contrary.
That's absolutely right. That is a spin-off of the situation anyway, because for many years earlier, even than Augustus, the Senate had assumed and continued to assume that they were the pinnacle of civilization. Everyone else, all of the people around them, were lesser, and what the Senate believed was truth. And they very often made pretty bad mistakes because, exactly as you say, they were overconfident and very, very fully in belief of their own superiority. And they didn't like to hear stuff that disagreed with them. That we see that happening time and time again. They didn't like Cleopatra, for instance, and all she wanted to do at that stage, Cleopatra the Seventh, Philopator, her ambition was that Rome and Egypt would come together. And yet the Senate hated her. She was a nasty foreign lesser being. And you know, it's not just her, but embassy after embassy was just looked down on and disregarded because they assumed that they were superior. You know, it's
so in that Absolutely. And in that Republican period, as I understand it, and part of my understanding of this was gleaned from reading your excellent books, which are set in the kind of immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination, that what spy networks there were kind of the individual spy networks of individually powerful men, and they were just as much being used against each other as they were being used in the service of Rome.
Yes, the sort of definitive example of this, Cicero's breaking down of the Catiline conspiracy. Cicero overcame Catiline's conspiracy to grab power in Rome because Cicero's personal spy network was more efficient than Catiline's was. And Cicero at that time was in a particularly powerful situation and was able to have Catiline arrested and actually executed because his his internal spy network was so efficient. And yet, when all of his closest friends were going up to murder Caesar, he had absolutely no idea what was going on, and in fact was extremely upset. It left him out of it. Caesar, he had the best spy network in Rome, and like Augustus later on, he just didn't believe what he was being told. When the post-mortem was conducted on his body, there was in his sleeve an unopened letter, for lack of a better word. It was some kind of writing anyway, which detailed the names of every single person at the center of the plot to kill him. And he didn't read it. It was given to him on the way into being killed. It was a list of all the people who were going to do it, and he never looked at it. That's bad intelligence.
Yeah, well, it's good intelligence, but bad timekeeping.
Yeah.
You said that the other, when we were sort of liaising before we talked, you said that there was one other major failure of intelligence that was quite illustrative of this early period, which was Crassus's defeat. Can you just talk us through that and what happened with that?
Of course. And then Crassus was the richest man in Rome, famously so. He had amassed his huge fortune because basically he had invented the fire service. And he had a whole lot of people who were expert in putting out fires. But whenever a fire started, and there were a lot of fires in Rome because the buildings were rubbish, hardly any of them as marble as we see them nowadays. The insulae were just clapboard rubbish. Whenever somebody's buildings went on fire, Crassus would get his men and he'd go round to the owner of the building. He's saying, now, do you want to give me half of what the building's worth? And my men will put the fire out, or do you want me to go off and just let it go down to the ground? And so he amassed an enormous fortune like that, so great, in fact, that he was able to pay for his own legions. And he paid for 3 legions, 17th, 18th, and 19th. And in 54 BCE, he took them to Armenia, and then the objective was to go via Armenia and into Parthia. Now, Parthia was basically what is modern Iran, only it's much bigger and famously enormously rich. And Crassus did seem to be somebody who just wanted more and more and more. And so he took his son Publius and another pretty effective general, and he spent the summer of 54 trying to get through into Parthia. What intelligence Crassus sent in seems to have been financial. He sent in traders because he wasn't really interested in the Parthians' military strength. He was interested in their financial matters. But the time that he spent there allowed the Parthian king Orodes and his general Serenus to learn about the legions and learn about Crassus's technique in battle. And the technique in battle that Crassus used was simply to send his legions in, and he was used to overwhelming his opponents. Now, Serenus, his troops were mostly mounted. He had heavily armored cataphrases on armored horses, and he had much lighter cavalry with bows and arrows. And Crassus was not particularly worried because everyone knew that mounted archers were of limited use in a battle because they ran out of arrows. General Serenus took this on board, and his preparation for battle involved making millions and millions and millions of extra arrows and loading them onto a camel train, which he could take with him. And so they ended up on a huge flat desert near Carrhae. And Crassus did what Crassus always did. And Serenus sent his archers to meet them. And the archers just kept firing. And even when the Romans did the famous tortoise, the testudo, their shields were never quite perfectly together, so arrows could pierce them. In any case, they only protected the top half of the body, and Parthian bowmen were shooting at their legs as well. So it didn't stop. Hour after hour of Crassus's troops broke, and then they sent the heavy armor in, and they killed his son. They forced Crassus to sue for peace. Crassus went to the general and tried to negotiate, but something went wrong, not sure what, and Crassus was killed. Famously, possibly not accurately, he was killed by having molten gold poured down his throat. However that is, whether it's true or not, it's certainly true that his head was chopped off and used as a prop in a play in front of the King of Kings, Orontes, later on. 20,000 killed, 10,000 were taken prisoner, and 10,000 got away. So he lost 3/4 of his army, his son and his head. And it so happened that the man who led the 10,000 survivors out, like Xenophon leading the Greeks to the sea, was Cassius. It was that action that cemented his position in Rome, but it was intelligence, failure of intelligence.
Were there any kind of intelligence successes in this earlier period, or was it all a story of Roman arrogance and failure?
Individual generals set up intelligence systems that worked well. Caesar famously did so, obviously. He managed to get intelligence from Britain. He certainly had intelligence in Gaul and northern Italy through the Alps. And in spite of what happened on the Ides of March, did pass it all on, because although Octavian had been with Caesar on campaign in Spain and through into Germany, and he and Caesar would ride in Caesar's coach together. And it is supposed that at that time, Caesar told Octavian,
Oh, Hilton, stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton, stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
A lot of the technique he had used to be successful, of course, Octavian became Augustus and started using those techniques as well. and passing them on to his closest friend and greatest general, Agrippa, Agrippa was just awesome. He's one of my great heroes, is Agrippa.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. What about Scipio? Didn't he have some quite strong intelligence successes in the Second Punic War?
Yes. He had learned it very much from Hannibal, and famously it was Scipio who sent Licinius, I think, senior centurion during the Second Punic War into the camp in disguise as a deserter. And in order to establish that this man was a deserter and give him reason to desert, he had him beaten, and the enemy simply did not believe, because of the reputation that the Romans had, that anyone would voluntarily undergo such humiliation for any reason whatsoever. So they assumed that because the centurion had been beaten to within an inch of his life, then he must be telling the truth when he said he was deserting and was coming over to the enemy. He was as an undercover project, and he sent an enormous amount of information back to Scipio. And this was during the North African campaign, of course, before Scipio managed to stop Hannibal in Italy itself, before he got his elephants to Rome.
Let's move out of the Republican period and towards the imperial period. Let's talk about Octavian Augustus. We've mentioned him a bit. How did he revolutionise the use of intelligence in the wider Roman Empire?
Yes, he did. The Bible is helpful there. It's the first sentence of the second chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. And it came to pass in those days that word came down from Caesar Augustus that all of the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first done when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. The first half is enormously important because it shows for the first time in a broad record that a Caesar Augustus had the ability to send to every single place in the world to either conduct a census or to exercise or to collect a tax. And that scale of intelligence was completely unknown earlier within the Roman Empire. And it was because Augustus had set up, joined together pre-existing systems. There was what effectively was the postal system that Caesar had helped, so that there were way stations on all of the routes in the empire, all of which, of course, led to Rome. Augustus then used military people, speculatores, to pass and collect messages and orders along those roads to all the far-flung outposts of the empire. Local people, governors, etc., they had their own men, because people they could trust even more than Augustus could trust his messengers. So that system continued until the end of the first century, when Domitian wanted something more efficient, and he then tasked the grain counters, the people whose job it was to go all over the empire, assessing the amount of grain, wheat, barley, oats, etc., to feed the army, etc. Domitian tasked them with becoming spies, and not just spies, executioners, etc. Though, of course, people had used them speculatories, for instance, as executioners earlier on. Herod famously used his speculatories bodyguard, led by Rome, to remove the head of John the Baptist, and Salome removed a large number of her clothes in front of him, to his great edification.
Can we talk a little bit more about the Frumentari? Do we know much about their organisation and their reach and who was in charge and how they fitted in when they report directly to the emperor, and how long did they last?
They lasted for centuries. Their headquarters was on the Cillian Hill in Rome, and they reported directly to their leaders reported directly to the emperor via elements of the Praetorian Guard, if need be. And because their day job, so to speak, was to go everywhere in the empire, their reach was infinite. Augustus, following on from Caesar, and then other emperors after him, as described, for instance, in Mary Beard's Emperor of Rome, successive emperors saw their job as being to keep an eye on the entire empire.
And were people frightened of the Frumentari?
Yes. They were more like KGB, the FSB, or the Spetsnaz in reputation than an actual post office. But of course, our modern post office has got a pretty bad reputation.
Yes.
As well. But yes, there was nothing they couldn't do. They could arrest, they could question, they could torture, they could execute, and then tell the emperor about it later, so to speak. Their reputation was probably greater than was warranted. The Romans had a reputation which they built on. So, for instance, Paul of Tarsus, who had been a Roman tax collector before he saw the light, literally, was arrested by villagers, and I can't remember where, and they were just about to beat him when he told them, civis Romanum sum, I am a Roman citizen. And it stopped them dead in their tracks, because they knew if they hurt a genuine, fully paid up Roman citizen, the next thing that would happen was that they were going to get a cohort or asking them what the hell they thought they were doing.
To create a culture in which there is that kind of level of, I guess, control, almost terror, you have to have an efficient secret police. You can't do it without. I can't think of an example of a sort of a society that exercises that level of control that doesn't have one. Peter, I think that is a fantastic summary of what we know about the spy networks of ancient Rome. So thank you so much. And I would highly recommend anybody interested in the subject to go out and buy your books on Caesar's Spies, the novels, and you can find them on Amazon. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to give us a follow. Never miss an episode. Next time, we'll be talking to Nigel West.
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here, wishing you a very happy half-off holiday, because right now Mint Mobile is offering you the gift of 50% off unlimited. To be clear, that's half price, not half the service. And Mint is still premium unlimited wireless for a great price. So that means a half day, yeah? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.